Wow, what a week it's been. I mean, the virus was wreaking havoc on us in so many ways, economically, emotionally, health. And now we see the world, America blowing up with protests, mini riots around the death in Minneapolis of George Floyd. You see tensions erupting. I mean, there's a explosive sort of anger underneath the surface that's ripping out right now. And it is heart-wrenching. And it's not just about race. It is about race. It's not just about unnecessary violence and a horrific violent act by police officers against an unarmed man. It's more than that. I really believe that what this pandemic has done has, in some ways, like it's unleashed our inner demons. People feel trapped and scared. And where do people turn when they feel trapped and scared? Well, some people turn to alcohol. Some people turn to drugs. Some people turn to emotional fixes. And some people turn to God. And I think right now, a lot of people are probably asking, where does God fit in this whole picture? Where does faith fit in? People of faith and people who maybe aren't of faith. I think all are asking right now, God, are you there? Earth to God, are you there? What's the answer? This is Rob Nelson Live.
Meet Rob Nelson, talk show host.
Because you got the 70s thing going there.
My name's Rob Nelson. I used to have a talk show on Fox, a show on Fox News, but news in America is so produced. I don't care if you think it's left, right, center, fake.
You passed tougher legislation to deal with the paparazzi after what happened with you and your family.
I think it's very important that we focus on rebuilding.
Welcome to Rob Nelson Live, streaming to you across all the platforms: Twitter, Periscope, Facebook, YouTube, Twitch. If you're there, we're here. I'm in Northridge. We're shooting. My producer Bruce is in Lakeside, and my guest is on the West Side. It's virtual reality, virtual studio, virtual streaming, all live, and we want you to be part of this conversation. I have an amazing guest today. About 6 months ago, I was on the beach in Santa Monica. I like to go to the beach. I go all year long. I don't care. I'll swim in the winter, spring, summer, fall. And I was on the beach and I saw all these people out in the water, but they were like wearing clothes. I was like, what's going on? Like literally, like it was like 50 people going in, out, clothes on. I'm like, who goes into the ocean in their clothes? Was this like a group of tourists that like forgot their swimsuits? I was like, something else is going on. I got a little closer and I realized they were like taking people and dunking them underwater. And as I got closer in the waves, I realized, oh my gosh, these people are being baptized. I mean, what else could it be? I mean, two people standing on either side of someone and a wave comes up and they wait and then they sort of lay them back under the water and pop them back up. Everybody comes out smiling, soaking wet. And I just had to know more. I'll be honest, it was the most beautiful thing. And I walked up to the people involved and check this short video out. This is my guest. Check it out. Okay, I'm here on the ocean. I came to go swimming, and I see these people. What are they doing? Huge crowd of people, and I realize they're doing a baptism in the ocean. So I came over. So you're the minister, right?
Yeah, we're both pastors. There's a Spanish language church.
Westside Vineyard Church, and they're doing a baptism in the ocean. And you got baptized. What's your name?
Will.
Tell me how you feel right now. Because watching as a viewer, just an observer, it was so beautiful. The power, the energy, so in a divided world we're in, and this is like, reaching out to God's love. Tell me.
So puedes decirlo en español, yo te lo traduzco en inglés. ¿Cómo te sientes?
Me siento bendecido.
I feel blessed.
Feliz
Happy,
de haber tomado cambiar mi estilo de vida,
changing my
ser
lifestyle,
una persona diferente,
be a different
una mejor
person.
persona.
All right, everybody, please welcome to Rob Nelson Live, my guest, Pastor Brad Bailey, the Westside Vineyard Church in Los Angeles. Pastor Bailey, Brad, thanks for being here. That was a strange way to meet, but I have to say, oddly enough, I said we're in such divided times and all that, and we are in even more difficult and divided times.
Yeah.
Your thoughts, your big picture thoughts on how divided we seem right now.
Well, I think that it's been very common for most people to talk for the last, 5 to 10 years about how we're becoming more polarized. And I think that the pandemic has become, one more event that's looking for a plot. And so we will bring our narratives to that plot, and it will, just deepen our sense of who is good, bad, right, wrong. And as a result of that, I think we're just, deepening our divide, if you will.
Do you think that's an interesting perspective, a narrative looking for a plot. Do you think that the virus, in a sense, is just bringing out what's already there in us? I mean, obviously, it's making people's lives harder and worse. But I mean, as a pastor, you see all kinds of people all the time, people in struggling, people in need, people seeking answers. Is it changed with this, or are we still asking the same questions, seeking the same answers?
No, I think it's an event with even more drama, and because people have so much time and we've been sitting with it for so long. At first it was almost united people, like we're all in this experience together. But once we began to try to come into that place of giving blame as to why we're in this, and try to look at the event and give it a plot line, then of course it provides an ability to once again kind of define who's right, wrong, and what have you, and so I think it just becomes another source to deepen those things, which I think is quite tragic, because I do think that we're likely to come out of this, and you and I've spoken about it, towards the elections. It's just going to have created a deeper divide as we kind of move towards the fall.
As a person of faith and as a pastor, do you look and see what kind of playing off what you're talking about? Do you see this? You see it creating more division amongst us. Do you see it affecting people in that way already? Do you already see those tensions flaring? Do you see it within your church community? I mean, you obviously see it around you. You're in Los Angeles, as I am. I know you have strong views about how much we need to not just stuck in our own narratives, but I think, as you said, this is making us more stuck.
Yeah, it might be helpful to think of this, that most churches tend towards reflecting or gathering people around a certain ideology, within their own political perspectives. So you've got churches that tend to be mostly Democrats, those who tend to be mostly Republicans. But there are churches, and ours is one of those, in which we really try to listen to the fact that God is bringing his kingdom. And so his kingdom is not that which can be reduced to either ideology, but it means you have people who have those ideologies, and we become easily divided by those. So it's very sensitive when you have more diversity. And I think the challenge is when certain things erupt, it raises those things more. And so many people who might have been able to relate in easy manner suddenly find that the ideas, the feelings, the blame and those things rise up. It happened a little bit after 9/11. It's happening a little bit now. And so there's a kind of a politicizing of any event.
Mm-hmm.
This is one of those. And so right now there's two narratives. There's the narrative that says that this is an issue of rights, and the other side says, no, this is an issue of responsibility. The one narrative says people are foolish, they're drinking the Kool-Aid, we don't need to do this, it's bringing economic trauma. And on the other side, you have a narrative that says, you're looking for freedom and dismissing facts, and you're causing physical harm. So you have these two narratives, and it's very hard to listen across those. But that, I think, is the challenge.
So I didn't realize that as much that churches, you feel like tend to divide congregations around a political ideology, which I find fascinating. Your church is a bilingual church, right? So
no, we have a separate Spanish language congregation. So we do our baptisms together. So that's why we had that particular moment. So we do have this interrelationship, but it's not really truly a bilingual.
Got it. But would you say that because of that, I mean, if you were to describe the sort of the content character of your church, you're saying it is more divided in the sense of there's both sides. It's not as much all Democrats, all Republicans, all left, all right. It's a little more mixed.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
I think we tend to be diverse because we really do try to be serious about Jesus. And if you're really serious about what he's saying, it's going to challenge you in terms of reducing things down to simply aligning with either. It should make us all uncomfortable, is another way to put it. And try to keep first things first and second things second. That's a challenge.
So I want to get into some of the faith-based stuff in a minute, but let's go with what's been in the news a lot, which is the whole issue of opening churches.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people have put it, and I get it, it's that, essentially church is in the First Amendment, your right to practice your religion. It's a freedom of speech and a freedom of religion. And a lot of people are saying, hey, you're telling me I can go to the grocery store. You're telling me I can go to the doctor. You're telling me I can't go to church. And churches even opened after certain other things in places. In California, they've now said churches can open. And your take on that? As a pastor, are you in a hurry to get the churches open? Are you? Did you feel it was like hey, we have a right to worship. People should, and I get it. The other side is, well, you're going to get a lot of people sick, and people are saying, well, okay, we might get people sick. I understand that from I grew up in a Christian faith, that the idea that you avoid a bad situation is almost like, no, let God protect you. And then people go, well, that could be stupid if you all get infected.
No, you've described it so well. That really is the conversation. And that's, why people have strong feelings about each of those sides. And I've followed it a lot. I've been engaged with a lot of different pastors and a lot of different folks, and some within our own community. And I think that, there is this strong feeling about rights, and I think understandably so, when people begin to perhaps already have felt that their faith is marginalized, or that government has become bigger and seems to have more role. So that's natural for these things to get triggered. But I think that for others, they feel that it's not so much a matter of rights. It's more of an issue of responsibility. And when you resolve the issue of rights, which just happened because Newsom gave very quickly, following Trump's announcement, gave permission for churches to meet with certain restrictions, and then Garcetti in Los Angeles County adopted those. Well, now we're left with the other side of those rights, and we're in responsibility, and that raises a different set of questions.
Mm-hmm.
What is responsible? And I think
what is responsible in this, Brad? Can you state your personal opinion? I know you represent a church, so you're in an interesting position, but do you feel we should have the right to worship in our place of worship?
Well, I think it depends on if you feel there's overreach. And so for those who make the alignment that we could be in grocery stores and all these other settings, but we can't gather in church buildings, I can understand that. I don't, and others don't necessarily see it that way, because we see this as much more has always been about public gatherings, the size of those gatherings, the sustained nature of gathering, which makes a huge difference, the nature of what takes place in that gathering. So I don't see that gathering in an enclosed church building is necessarily the same as the duration and movement that comes with shopping. But I can see why people make the comparisons. But I think that many recognize it really has a lot to do then in terms of the size, the nature,
right.
A lot of reasons that this isn't a one size fits all kind of a.
And what this is kind of moving toward the faith thing. I mean, the notion that, I'm not saying this in a discriminatory or critical way, pejorative way, people who would say, but again, our whole history of the Christian faith has been to trust God, have faith in God. Moses led the people, through the Red Sea. Like, you don't shy away from danger. You trust God to carry it through. So I'm not being a good Christian if I'm not willing to put myself out there. What would you say to those? And they're well-intentioned. They're not saying it just to stir things up. They're saying it because some part of them feels like God's testing me right now.
Sure. There's a natural sense that boldness is in and of itself kind of an exciting thing, that we all need to be more bold, and that can be a great expression of faith. I think one needs to stop and ask the question, though, when is it presumption? Because God's given us all sorts of means to protect ourselves. He's given us food to eat. He's given us, medicines to take. And so what says that social distancing isn't a means to deal with a virus? And so is there any reason to be throwing that away or turning aside from it, or presuming that somehow by faith we don't utilize what the good sense that we have. Wisdom is also of great value, and we wanted to exercise that. So I think people need to have permission to not presume that they're exercising more faith by not, or by in any way dismissing good sense in these types of things.
Right. Just want to say to everybody watching, if you have questions, excuse me, if you have questions, feel free to text them in, and we'll try to get a few of them up on the screen, you know, at the right moments. Because definitely want to hear people's responses. And I'm kind of building up toward talking about faith itself with you, Brad. But I kind of want to jump into some that's been going on now. And I started up by talking about what's happening in Minneapolis and now across the country. And it's funny because when I met you in September, there'd just been an incident of gun violence in Texas, and that was, we actually talked about it on the beach. And by the way, I haven't seen Brad since then. This is our reconnection. But so, you know, I look and I think, God, like, once again, and I'm not saying, yes, the racism issue, and yes, the white on black police, white police, black, you know, citizen issue, but there just seems to be this anger exploding across the country. And, you know, again, people are now protesting hundreds and hundreds at a time, which so much for, you know, trying to social distance, like they're, you know, we're having riots and people throwing things and burning buildings and the cops shooting on them, and all because of this horrible, senseless act of violence. And I look and I go, as a pastor, I know as a human being, I struggle and go, wow, this is a hard time. Like emotionally, it's hard on people. People feel they're losing their lives. People are dying, not of the, I don't mean of the violence, I mean from the pandemic. And millions of people are out of work, and people are scared about having jobs and futures and losing their homes. As a pastor, as a human being, but as a pastor who's a human being, does it break your heart? I mean, how do you handle that going, one, to your parishioners, congregants, whatever you would call them, but two, in your own relationship to God? I mean, do you look up sometimes and go, where are you? We need a little more? Or does it make you discouraged, hopeful? I'm putting a lot of options out there.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And even recognizing how much those tensions are real. And I think they reflect that there's conversations that we've been trying to have that have not reached the point in which they've really helped us to resolve those deeper issues, and particularly in terms of, you know, racial injustice. And so you get these touch points, and you know, I think there's a lot of activity that's, you know, rightfully people will criticize as not really honoring this life or other lives, because sometimes it's just taking advantage of something. But I think it's a reflection ultimately that we're not having a better conversation. And so we're going to, you know, act out in whatever we need to do to try to awaken something. And I think that, you know, I've talked about this, but I think that people can see religion as one of the things that divides. And I think there can be great truth to that, but I don't think it's truly religion. Or we need to ask ourselves, what do we mean when we say, let's say, religion divides? I think the common denominator is identity. When we find ourselves so deeply in our identity, whether that be gender, politics, generational, racial, any of those, then that becomes the thing that I identify with, and then I am different from you, and so we're divided by our difference.
Right.
And yes, there's something that actually can call us together. And so I don't.
And is that to interrupt you? Is that in your mind God or faith that can do that can call us together?
I believe that religion will itself as an identity can lend itself to superiority and separation. Those are the two evils, and they play out in everything. But if we'll step back and realize that's not religion per se, that's just our humanity. However you want to play out separation and superiority. But I think when Jesus says, he's asked, you know, teach us to pray. And the first two words are, our Father. If we would sit with those two words, they will challenge the very depths of who we really are and who we are in relationship to one another, and the deep and calling to live that out. And so I do think ultimately that understanding that we are all created in God's image is at the root, and we have to go deeper in these things.
Do you, I started to ask this before, and I'm going to ask it sort of again. Do you personally, does this whole experience challenge your faith? I'm not saying that to try to get you to go, yeah, no, I'm questioning God. I want to talk about that more. I think there's nothing wrong with having your faith challenged. I think that's, Thomas was the doubting Thomas, and Jesus loved him, right? He wasn't like, stop questioning me. He was like, good for you, question away. But does it make you question? Because I think a lot of people listening go, as a pastor, as a religious leader, questioning, or is it you just feeling totally secure?
Yeah, it hasn't led that, but I can understand people with the natural question, where is God? Why we have this pandemic, so much suffering, from the loss of lives to the economic trauma of this time, would certainly be questions that might raise one to say, where is the goodness of God in this? However, I think that we are always faced with that kind of a question, and God, in my mind, actually, God says this is a world that is out of sync with the way God created it. So I guess I expect out of syncness, and so it doesn't cause me to question my faith. It causes me to want to say, God, I know that you grieve in this. You're the one who's been grieving maybe the most in a world that lives out of sync on so many levels. So this isn't entirely new to that. And the question is, how do I see what God wants to do in the midst of this?
Right.
There's everything that he wants to do. So
I like that. Everything he wants to. I want to come back to that. We have a question here. Jimmy Stock. Bruce, can we pop that up? Yeah. Can you see that, Pastor? It seems that many people have turned from God in the last 30, 40 years. What role does church play in healing this conflict and, that's kind of growing in our country? Now, before you answer that, Bruce, we have a second video. I don't know if we have 2 or 3, but do we have the second video, which is talking about that? Great. Let's pop it up. There's Bruce.
Yeah, we'll cue it up right now.
All right, perfect.
You want to do it now?
Let's do it.
I really am aware of how divided we are right now as a world, and people literally full of hate. We're in a tortured time, suicides, and there's so much pain in the world. And I think for a lot of people, they don't see religion as an answer because they think it's, just another box to get put in. What would you say to all those people? Because I can see the love coming out of this.
Well, I think people are right when they say that religion can divide, And I think Jesus saw that religion could divide. Everything that divides us is usually so that we can feel we're on the inside and feel better about ourselves. So we try to divide around our differences. And the only way that we won't be divided by our differences of race or political or gender or anything else is if something larger than us unites us.
So, Brad, very eloquently said, and it's something you're already touching on. And now we have a question from a listener about, the last 30, 40 years and kind of now where we're coming to, the role of church in all this. It's a big question. I realize that. But, how do you see, organized churches playing into this? And you're non-denominational, right? I mean, it's not the same as, say, a Catholic church or a Jewish temple, but so in some ways you may be more inclusive, but how do you address that? And kind of picking up on what you said on the beach that day about the division, but the question also, what role is church playing in healing the conflict? Not causing it, but healing it.
Yeah. Well, I think, to respond to Jimmy, who's noting that people have, turned away, and I think people aren't really turning to something. They're mostly just feeling more lost. Actually, I see that a lot among younger lives, is that there's almost like there's no center in some ways, and for good reasons, because perhaps the church and other institutions have really failed at that. So the question he asks is, what role can the church play? Not just what it has played. I think in many ways we've fallen very short. And again, if we get defined by other things other than what God says, then of course we are going to end up on that. But I think the church should and can have the potential to bring us humility, where we can admit that we have done deep wrongs. And I think we have to go back to that in terms of racial injustice. And I know that's very difficult to go back to, and people struggle to know if that's always fitting or why should I feel blamed. But we have to sometimes go back to the ability to recognize that there have been great wrongs. And I think when there is grace, we have the ability to say, I'm a part of, or an extension of some deep wrongs in this. And we need to be not afraid of the responsibility of that. So I think we need grace to be able to admit some wrongs. And I think then we begin to, identify with the fact that there are injustices, and I am being called to love my neighbor, and to not merely love, those who love me, but to love even, enemies, so to speak, not because people are enemies, but because maybe we have some animosities. And so I think it's the calling to be pursuing real relationship and real rights, not we live in a bit of in my mind, one of the challenges, we live in kind of a bumper sticker response, to things. And so we want to feel better about ourselves rather than becoming better people. So it's easy to feel better. I just have to, like something on Facebook, or, acknowledge something on a very superficial moment.
Brad, let me ask you something, then I'm going to go to another question. I often ask this question. I used to joke, what would Jesus do? Because I feel like most of us don't really follow Jesus very well, and I'm not saying that's easy. I mean, and whether you're a Christian or not, Jesus certainly was a noted historical figure, and much of what he did is recorded. So whether you believe he's the Son of God or not, he was a pretty exemplary human being who really lived by his principles. And I often wonder, Brad, what would Jesus think right now if he were walking around on earth and looking at all of us, including organized religions? I know that's a what if question, but what's your just gut response to that? Would he shake his head and be like, wow, you've all got it wrong? Would he, obviously he'd have compassion, but I mean, would he look at churches and organized religion and be like, you're no different than the temples?
That's a great question. And I think it's, there's so much that could be said, but I think, again, he would look towards where we are in any way carrying on, and it's not merely religion, but we do it so much with it, with separation and superiority. And I think of that one incident that is maybe familiar to some, where a woman is caught in adultery, and it's even questionable how somehow she alone is caught in it, but she's brought before the local village. You couldn't have an event that brings more shame. They throw her down, and they try to get Jesus to have to decide should she be stoned or not. All of the people pick up their stones and begin to get ready to stone her. And Jesus responds by saying those famous words, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone." And I find it so profound, because in that moment it says they drop their stones one by one. And then there's this little line that many people don't catch, which is, "with the oldest first." And I wonder, why is that? And I think perhaps because as we get older, life has a way of sobering us. We begin to realize we're not the people we thought we idealized to be. And we all need to get a little bit more sober. But I say that because I think in some ways what we've started to do as a culture too much is we just want to identify the sinner. We want to identify the racist. We want to identify, and then we want to project all of our shame onto them, as opposed to coming as a community of people who all are sinners, who all bear shame, who are all hypocrites.
So that's to
identify them, and identifying them just creates good and bad people. We can blame the other group, and it's all about feeling better about ourselves.
Right. And I think that's a really powerful point. And I've said before, I spent time in working with a group in San Quentin and working with prisoners in for life. And it was amazing because the ones we were working with weren't coming out, but they couldn't undo what they did wrong. They knew that. They could never make up amends to the victims or to their own families and that they had destroyed and, being removed from life for the rest of their life. But they were all trying, and they were all trying to, and they were working with victims groups, and it was amazing how much you could sense a sense of redemption within them, that they could never undo it, and the connection they had with the victims groups and with people who were going, no, I don't, maybe I forgive them, maybe I don't, but and they didn't want to continue the cycle forward. And it made me see even people we think of, we often go, they're done, out, boom, have a chance on this earth for redemption. But I flip that, Brad, and go, at the same time, we're looking at what's happening in Minneapolis, and you've got the cop. And you can say I'm rushing to judgment, but I look at that and go, he should be, he is facing murder charges, and he should. I see no justification for that horrific behavior. And it's hard not to judge. I mean, I do judge, and I go, what is wrong with you? He's a handcuffed man on the ground. Like, why are you kneeling on his neck when he's screaming, I can't breathe? And I'm judging. I'm totally judging. And how do we not judge those things? I mean, how do we not? And all these riots are about judging. And again, I don't think people should be violent, but I get people protesting. I get people being like, enough. Yeah, no, absolutely. And it is so hard. And we all have that within us. We all have the propensity to judge, and it's hard, but I think somewhere we need to pull apart judging the behavior and condemning the behavior without necessarily condemning the person and their being. Because when we need to become stronger at saying that behavior is fundamentally and absolutely evil and wrong, without thinking we can divide people quite as easily in that same way. So if you were to do that in the case of this police officer in Minneapolis, how would that break down? I mean, I get what you're saying, but how would you tell if parishioners came to you and were like, we're so angry and this man should burn? How would you do that? How would you say that about this incident? What would you tell people? Well, it seems to me the behavior is ultimately and probably will find some level of prosecution. And the behavior has to be absolutely brought to all the consequences that it should bear, and that we as a culture and society have said those are the consequences that are fitting for such behavior. Absolutely. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that the best way to do this is to say that we get to just cast all evil. When we say we found a racist and we feel really good, we also have to look at our own racial struggles and prejudices instead of thinking that we've just resolved it because we found one. It's not like it's all in just them. But when you're but when you're looking at, Brad, when you're looking at a person of color, whether it's a black person or a Latino person showing outrage at this, more say than a white person showing outrage. Mm-hmm. How do you respond to that? Same way? I mean, again, understanding you get where they may feel, particularly a black person could go, I'm sorry, I'm tired of this. I'm tired of feeling like our lives don't mean as much. And I'm angry. What do you say to that? You should be angry, forgive them. I don't want to simplify it. I know it's not easy, but people have got to be coming to you with, and there's gun violence has been going on ridiculous in the last couple of years. And, and a lot of people of color are the victims. Yeah. No, I think exactly what you said. You should be angry. And in fact, I think that we need to not only affirm the anger, and we need to also affirm what needs to be changed. Otherwise, all we do is affirm the anger, and we're not really resolving anything. It might make us feel good to just affirm the anger and then be done with it. We've done our little YouTube post or what have you. But the truth is, there's a reason why particularly younger Black lives feel frightened, no matter what. No matter any other circumstance, they do not feel safe. And there's a good reason for that. And there's an underlying prejudice, and there's an underlying presumption upon lives that is unfair. And so that has to be something that we don't just have these top incidences where we talk about it and then end it, but we've got to push this conversation further. And I guess what I'm getting at is, in a nutshell, how do you do that without condemning the person? Because I understand people who want to condemn the person, but as a person of faith or following Jesus, it's like, what's that? We need to condemn our racism, not this individual police officer. If we continue to just pull somebody out, throw them in front of our culture, just like the woman brought before Jesus, and then think we can project all of our own shame, rather than dealing with our own shame and carrying this forward, we're not going to get anywhere. We're just going to walk away after we've stoned them. Well, that's carry on. That's really interesting. I think I want people to think about that, because I think that's a hard viewpoint for people to get, which is, no, even in this instance, you can't be casting the stones either, because none of us is above it. That doesn't mean you can't condemn the racism. It doesn't mean what this person did is okay, but it doesn't give you permission. Well, you can do whatever you want, but if you're a person of faith, and I think that's got to be the hardest thing in the world, to not, I get it. Like, right. We all want to throw the stone when we feel justified.
Well, and I'm not saying that we don't have a very appropriate sense of condemning the behavior and bringing
Right.
that person to the full consequences.
Right.
We have to keep going beyond that and make sure that we're also willing to
Right.
face what is wrong within us as
Right.
people, and within our history, and
Yep.
within what's
Right.
still we're struggling with in our nature.
Right.
We've got to continue that. Otherwise, it becomes a very shallow moment, and
Right.
all we do is wait for the next eruption. And you and I have talked about this, but I really, one of the reasons your show should be so valued is because what we call the news has, in many ways, in my mind, actually become kind of a playing out of that scene with Jesus. A lot of news strikes me as this channel is here to make a certain group feel really good about themselves and spend an hour talking about what somebody said and how I'm much smarter, morally better, morally superior. And then you have another group who watches something else and it plays on the same. I think we're going to have to transcend that sense of moral rightness and realize we've got to be humble enough to look at things within ourselves.
Mm-hmm. That's a great response. All right, well, I'll move to my last sort of thing about faith and losing faith. But I have a quick question here that Rick Tejas, he says, why is it that political parties try and take ownership of religion? Christ would not have called that okay. I'm paraphrasing the question. He would have called the behavior out. And would you say, Brad, I would, that I think both parties in different ways try to take ownership. Republicans may try to take more ownership of religion in some ways, but I think it is something that both sides try to take the moral high ground when it comes to God.
Absolutely. And, politics is about trying to gain the greatest sense of approval and support. And that's understandable. And the truth is that if you really look at what is it that God has challenged humanity about and spoken into, that Jesus really brought to its fullest and clearest sense, you have issues that fall on both sides. I think that Republicans will reduce, or conservatives will tend to reduce the moral or religious issues to this, and Democrats or liberals might raise these other issues, whereas all those issues really do have a moral challenge, and I think ultimately a rightful challenge within faith and what we believe God has said. So I think that I go to the primary and secondary. I think what's many people would say, I'm not saying anything very novel here, is that one has to say, is my primary identity that I give my allegiance to what God has said and my need for him, and my political ideologies play second to that, and they will always submit to that.
Well, that is
reverse it. And I think we don't want to admit it, but much of the time we are so enjoying what our ideologies give us in terms of superiority and such, that we really do allow that takeover, which is what's been talked about.
Rick Tejas was saying, right. And I agree. And I think it's interesting because I think we really are, it's interesting how you frame it, but we do feel a sense of superiority about our views. And to me, it's both sides. It's all sides of issues have kind of done that. No, to me, I look and I see the entire, especially around politics, everyone feels a superiority with their views. And I don't see how we ever find common ground until we go, I have to see, it's like two enemies. It's like you have to sort of decide. It's not like you're suddenly going to all see the same thing. You have to decide, we're willing to look past it and find common ground. And right now what scares me is we're in a world where increasingly that common ground is spilling away. So Brad, my last sort of question, we talked about this before, was I wanted to touch a little on people holding on to their faith. I think it's a hard time, and that, and a lot of people watching might know there's a popular Christian band called Hawk Nelson, and their lead singer, John Seingard, he'd been a lead singer for like 20 years, came out on Instagram and posted last week a very emotional sort of, I need to say this, I no longer believe in God, and it's the hardest thing I've ever had to say. And his bandmates and other people in the Christian rock community, I thought were amazing in the way they responded, which was, we support you, we love you, we care about you. And ultimately, whether you believe right now or not isn't the issue, because our belief is still there and for you. And it reminded me of a time in my own life where I went through a real doubting phase based on my Christian upbringing. And I was doing a show on Fox News, and I had a Monsignor from the Catholic Church on. And we were talking about God and whether God existed. And I was really in a phase of, I can't say there's no God. I'm not going to pretend I know that, but I can say I don't believe in it. And if he is there, I don't think he's really very nice. Like, he's not doing nice things. And we had a very fascinating conversation. And afterward, the Monsignor sent me an email, and he thanked me for how we'd handled it, and so it felt like it was a great conversation. And then he signed off with, and by the way, the God you don't believe in sends you his love. And it made me laugh. I thought it was sort of the perfect way of he's saying, you don't believe in him, that's fine. He's still loving you. But it makes me wonder how right now, are you seeing people's faith being challenged? Even within your own congregation, are people going, man, this is making me ask hard questions. I'm starting to wonder. I know you said your faith is rock solid, which is great, but I can understand how people would feel doubtful right now. And do you see that?
I don't see that, and I haven't seen too much that.
Wow.
I haven't heard too much about that necessarily being an issue. Again, I think people who really understand what God has revealed would say that he said this world is very out of sync. So I don't think people are, shocked, by anything perhaps. But I think people become, and going to the point of the person who just shared their own disillusionment and perhaps loss of faith, is that I think people become deeply disillusioned, many younger, with what they see in people of faith, what they see in Christianity. And most of those conversations never really speak of having lost anything of their respect for who Jesus is or the truth of that. They've really become, I don't want to be a part of this, the way I see it lived out. And whether it's the hypocrisy or there's just contradictions in what people are telling me. So I see lots of people having grown disillusioned with that. I think more deeply about that and the questions of faith comes the reality of, but where does one go? And I think that people find themselves not so much going anywhere, but just feeling a bit of loss, because true, many would say, but I'm not an atheist because I can't really go down the road to believe that there is absolutely no good and bad. There's almost the implications, because all these longings in me point to the longing, but I'm struggling to find what I'm longing for and see it really embodied. I actually do see it embodied in Jesus. I'm having a harder time usually seeing it embodied in the world that I live in.
Interesting.
And that, I think, becomes a big point. And I think one more thing, Rob, I think for a lot of people, there's this sense that, science has, that's another issue by which we can say that, well, is science leading us away? But I think, again, only if people are forced to make these assumptions about what the scriptures actually teach, it's really poor assumptions that I believe are there. And I think the truth is, really, we've got to come back to the place in which we realize the more we know, and that's so good that we know a lot, but Einstein and every really great scientific mind up until recently has said the more you know, the more you don't know. In other words, we shouldn't be saying there's no God when we're like, well, how would you ever, perceive that,
Well, and it's interesting you say that, because it's a kind of a nice place to be bringing our conversation to winding it down, because I think, Brad, that we are in a time where people often think it's faith versus science.
Yeah.
And I even taught faith versus the virus is what I call this episode, but faith versus science. And I do think it's a false choice. I think you're saying the same thing, but I understand why people go there. and why they think one competes with the other. Because a lot of people, faith implies something that can't be proven. You know, Paul said, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen, right? By definition, faith is believing in something that you don't have proof of. It's not, oh, see, it happened, I have faith. It's like, no, now you have proof. Like, faith is that ability to believe without the proof because there's something bigger. You know, and I always think to the idea that people have often said, well, you know, where did God, it can't be a God. Where did God come from? And I always think, well, where did God come from? I don't know. God existed forever. Well, that's not possible. That's crazy. That's not science. Well, where did the universe come from? Well, the universe existed forever. You know, it came from a Big Bang. Where did the Big Bang come from? Something existed forever. That's science. So to me, they seem like science and faith are both things we don't fully understand, but people struggle with faith because they can't technically prove it.
Yeah, and I would frame it also to note that we are very we presume that the only thing that's real is the material world and the physical world, but that's an assumption that we carry on. We at least think it's more real than being spiritual creatures. We think we're human bodies. We don't really actually believe we're human beings. We kind of see ourselves as human bodies. So through the pandemic or through other things, we identify with how we look and our physicality and our health. But actually, I'm not sure that we have a basis for that assumption. What if our spiritual nature is as or more real or more eternal? And when we begin to think that way, it begins to help us to realize that maybe the science and hope and faith are really two very different things. And even the word of proving is really carrying on certain assumptions, because we're presuming the only thing that is real is what's physical. And actually, I don't think anyone truly lives out that belief.
And the only thing that's real is what we can prove. I mean, I've often been that way, and that's why I use that definition of faith. I think faith is very powerful. I think there is something in, you know, it's somewhat allegorical that there's letters and stuff, but Einstein, you know, people talk a lot about the Einstein letter about love, in which he said the most powerful force in the universe is love. And I think we've all seen that intangible forces have power. I'm sure as a pastor, you know, love is a force. It's a power. It's not just something, you know, out there. It can change things. And that's not something that's provable. My love healed it. My love fixed it. My love changed it. But we know it works, right?
Absolutely. And I think if we ask ourselves, so do we really believe that there's no such thing as love, that it's purely biological, chemical? I mean, because that's what we'd have to really come to. I see few people who really believe that everything can be reduced to merely chemical reactions right out. And there's no deeper meaning. There's nothing else to the nature of that. You know, and so I think there is a force of love, and I think it has a source.
Yeah. And thus, you know, Jesus is love one another. God is love, you know.
And I think what we see in imperfection comes from the perfect. In other words, if we think love here in all of its very limited fashions, because none of us feel very perfect, we struggle to love, all of us, we'd have to ask ourselves, if love has that force, from where does it come? Does it have its perfection? And I think that is God.
And last thing, Brad, if you were talking to people who are listening who maybe aren't religious or aren't perhaps practicing faith right now or questioning their faith, what would you say if they said to you, Brad, I'm having a hard time having faith right now. I want to, and everything you've said already, Brad, you know, what would you say to that person who's just like, I'm struggling. I just don't know if I have faith, and I want to have it.
Yeah.
The key being, I want to have it. Not like trying to prove why I should, but saying, how do I find it right now? And I know that's not a 5-second answer, but you say we're not in a soundbite culture, and yet, you know, he who among you without sin cast the first stone is a pretty solid soundbite, you know? So what's the Pastor Brad Bailey soundbite version of my faith is being challenged, but I want to have it?
Yeah, I would say, first of all, what someone feels is, is real. It's real as a feeling. It doesn't, necessarily should we fear that just what we feel is leading us to some, desperate ultimate reality. It is what we feel. So I wouldn't want to dismiss what someone's feeling, and I'd want to explore why they're feeling that too. And I think when we go through times of suffering, we all, when times are hard, whether we've got economic loss or health loss or relational loss, we will all start to find ourselves, you know, just feeling negative, if you will. We don't feel as enthused for things. So I think we all have to stop and do a lot of just kind of checking the inner temperatures, if you will. But if what's reflected in such a thing is the struggles to know where is God in the midst of this, I would want to help people believe deeply God is the one who's most present with us. And when we're physically distanced, there is one who is spirit, meaning he is present with everyone right now, wherever they're sitting. And
So
he is perhaps more present than we're present. In other words, he might be the one waiting for us to show up.
so I'm determined to reduce this to a bite that I can use for
Yeah.
me too. So
You want
is
the
the summary of that, I want to have faith? Well, is it a sort of that, Monsignor? God loves you no matter what. So he's there when you're ready for, I mean, is that what it is? Like you may be questioning, you may be doubting, but it doesn't change that his love is there for you. I don't know. Is that too simplified? I mean, because I think a lot of people right now really are asking this question. Like, my faith has been challenged. It's not that they don't want to have it. They're not sure how to have it in the world we're in. And they turn more into the paths we're talking about, the division, the divide, I have to protect myself, that.
Yeah.
Is there a 30-second version of that someone could take home tonight?
I don't think it would be a very fair and human one. But let me just say that in this pandemic, just to maybe end with this thought, what is it we're all being struck with? One of them is identity. Who am I when I'm suddenly unable to be, one, in the circle of the people who know me, but also doing what I normally do, because we're all reduced down often to what we do. So much of the question is, oh my, who am I? And where's my well-being? These are questions of identity. And I think that's a time to say, am I somebody who's more than merely what I do? And that's a spiritual question. And I think that's one that God wants to say, you're my son, you're my daughter. You're not merely what you do. So I think it can draw us towards those kinds of issues, along with, many other things. We're wondering, is there any future that has hope? And hope is about what lies ahead of us. And I think many people are at a loss for hope, but there's a God who says that ultimately good will prevail. And so I can move forward knowing that there's a God who's calling me towards a good that is greater than what I see right now, a world that's bigger than the containment of this pandemic. So what is it that God offers? What is it? Why do I believe that in a very fallen and now very contained and traumatized world that there is something better? Those would be the directions I would encourage someone to look for.
I think that's helpful. That's solid. I know it's not fair to try to soundbite it, but at the same time, well, at the same time, I'm looking for the sound, like we do think in sound bites, and I am trying to distill it down to, something people can take away and go, you know what? And maybe it is that idea of identity, maybe it is about giving up. Your identity's been challenged in this time. Your world's been challenged. So maybe part of having faith right now is not that you believe with such certainty, that you're so sure of how the world works, you're so sure of God's role, you're so sure of this, but maybe it's a trust that in the uncertainty, goodness can emerge, beauty can come, life grows, and that it's okay to live in uncertainty as long as we stick to the principles that matter, to our foundational truths, to loving our neighbor, to being our best selves. Maybe that's what it is.
And if I could just conclude with this thought that's been helpful to me the last few years, so not just in this, but I think we do have to live with more and more uncertainty. But I think, so how do we do that? What does it mean? And I think in part, I trust what I don't understand by what I do understand, meaning I am a finite being. And I cannot presume that I'm going to understand the infinite, which is sovereignty and all sorts of ways that the world works. So I live as a finite creature, having to entrust myself to the infinite and not presuming it. So I trust what I don't understand, but what I do understand. And in my understanding, the one thing I know is that I believe God has come in this world, and this is the gospel that I believe of the whole message, the central issue, that God's come in this world and he so loved it that he gave his life for it, so that, you know, the problem, if you will, of sin, which is much of what we've been talking about, can actually be overcome. There can be that bridge. And in some ways, it's saying there's a larger virus, a spiritual virus, and he's the vaccine. And that is what I rest in when I don't know and understand all sorts of other things. But so that's good news that I move towards.
Brad, and we've got about a minute left, but I really want what you just said. I just want to wrap on something, and I'm going to need a quick response. But it occurs to me, what you just said, a lot of people I know feel like they kind of go down on Christianity and Christian faith, and not just Catholics. It's like non-denominational, born again, and they see it as like, oh, they're Jesus lovers. It's like as if they're crazy people. And I'm listening to you, and your message is one of love for everyone, but it is centered on Jesus is the Son of God. And so for those who would go, well, I don't know if I know that, maybe I'm Jewish, whatever, what is the response that says, you know, yes, you know, God is there, whether you're seeing it exactly the way I've always said, if I don't see God the way you see it, does that mean God's not there for me? And I know I don't want to get you down a whole path that's like a 2-hour thing, but we are trying to find common ground. So what is the common ground there for a person who's religious but doesn't believe in Jesus as the Son of God the way a Christian does?
Well, I think we have to ask the question, are we committed to each other's common good, irregardless of whether we agree? And I just, and so I think that that's what we haven't proven. And that's something that Jesus showed, which is, he didn't care for merely those who agreed with him or followed him, were devoted to him, or were his friends rather than his enemies. So if I think that spiritual truth is something we really should be pressing for and discussing and in conversation with, but I don't think that agreement on that is what defines whether we should care about the common good of one another. Mm-hmm. And so I think we've got to learn how to value both of those. We're not looking to get rid of and just say everybody believes the same thing, and that's a very false tolerance.
Right. So it's a false choice. We can have different faiths and a common ground and a common, what I love what you said, a common quest for spirituality, and to define that spirituality and to understand that spirituality and even to practice that spirituality.
I think someone well quoted it when they said that if we really look at Jesus, he had very exclusive truth claims, but he had very inclusive love aims. And I think it's very true. He loved inclusively, but he wasn't allowing truth to be made just inclusive of everything. In fact, that's illogical.
That's going to be our next conversation. We're going to dive into that. Pastor Brad Bailey, the Westside Vineyard Church in Los Angeles. Thank you. You've been a great guest. I'd love for you to come. I would like to continue this. I think this stuff is really relevant right now. And the world needs to have this conversation across faiths, across religions, across political divides. So thanks for being part of it.
Thank you, Rob. Thanks for the privilege.
Appreciate it.
To all those listening.
Thank you. All right. Bruce, you there? Thanks, Brad. Bruce, my producer. Bruce, hey, buddy. Good show, right? This guy's informative. It's so interesting, like the perspectives. And I know, Bruce, you're a Catholic and we're out of time, but just your quick thoughts. Did it inspire you, make you think, challenge you? Bruce is like the barometer.
Yeah, Brad, I wanted to say, keep up the good work. We need someone putting out some positivity out there. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, everybody. Thanks for watching Rob Nelson Live. Every Friday night, we do it with a guest. Every Wednesday night, we do it with me on a crazy rant, and always your interaction, your participation. The goal here isn't to get you to think one way or the other. It's to get you to think about things, open your mind, challenge your narratives, and just look at the bigger picture. None of us knows all the answers, as my guest, Pastor Bailey, said. And the more we think we do, we probably don't. So try looking at a viewpoint you're not sure of tonight. Give the other side a view. Wouldn't that be the best test of all? Instead of reinforcing what you do think about what you don't. Maybe go in a Facebook group you don't support, and instead of challenging them, just listen. That's what I'm trying to do. I'm Rob Nelson. It's Rob Nelson Live.